This is the Navajo lecture after we have finished the movie Cromwell on Wednesday, the 17th of November, 2021. Could those in back please open the shades? Yes.
So they mentioned the king's last name. Was it Stewart?
Yes.
Like Mary Stuart?
Yes, same family.
Okay.
The Stuarts were the royal family of Scotland. This is European history, in case I didn't mention it. And when Queen Elizabeth died in estate without a child to inherit, James Stuart becomes King of England. This is by arrangement. So the King of England, the King of England, James I, is also the King of Scotland, James, I think, the Sixth. The Stuarts were a freaking disaster in England because in Scotland, whereas things were much more disorganized, the king seemed to have a much stronger hand. The king was more of an autocrat. He could do his own thing. There was no strong tradition of parliament and limits. So we're going to learn more after Thanksgiving, or later this week or after Thanksgiving, about the pretensions of the Stuarts, James I, Charles I, who got the chop, and then Charles II, who is restored after the death of Cromwell, and James II, who is finally overthrown by the Parliament and a new dynasty that is much more open to the idea of a balance between king and Parliament is established. The Stuarts never adapt to the English way of doing things, and their insistence on a pretension towards autocracy, towards independent power, is a constant problem. Yeah.
Charles II was the son?
Yes, he was the one that went off to France with his mom. Cromwell, obviously, this movie ends in sort of a bombastic way, talking about Cromwell's achievements. The achievements are real. But he was a bloody-minded, bloody-handed dictator who did such violence in Ireland that to this day, Irish parents still tell their children, be good or Oliver Cromwell will come and get you. Seriously, if you know anything about Irish history, you know that there comes a point where the English really sink their claws, their talons deep into Ireland, at least for a while, and this really happens under Cromwell. Cromwell is the instrumental figure in those talons, going deep into the flesh of the body politic of Ireland. Cromwell does make England militarily strong. And the key to all of this is the new model army. 50,000 men, highly trained, highly armed, and the British learn a lesson from this. Because the army in this Civil War period is a lot more like a Latin American army or an army somewhere in Eastern Europe or the Third World, where the army is a threat to the people more than any foreign neighbor. The army is the arbiter of all disputes. The army decides. Can I ask you guys to hand these out, please? Thanks. And anyone who's, I think you're all here. So the army predates upon the government and the people, replacing governments willy-nilly. Cromwell retained the authority over the new model army, which is how he could dismiss Parliament. What that means is that corrupt Parliament, and it was a corrupt Parliament. No, the movie does a good job of showing that. The Parliament had been elected a dozen years before this crisis with Charles I begins. Charles deals with the Parliament, dismisses them. They're gone for 12 years. He has to bring them back for money. They put conditions on the money. He says, no, you're dismissed again. And then we go through the entire Civil War period and the period after Charles's execution up to the time Cromwell dismisses them. And there's no elections. We're talking about 30 years of Parliament that's supposed to be a legislature in representation of the English people, with no elections. Imagine that the U.S. Congress was in charge. Oh, God, no. And that the U.S. Congress that was elected, 30 years ago. So in 1991, that Congress was still in charge. And they wouldn't go to elections. They wouldn't put themselves up for election. So by the end, this is called the Rump Parliament, because a bunch of parliamentarians die, and they're killed during the war, and are removed for corruption, So what's left is this rump of a parliament that rules corruptly. No, Cromwell did need. I think it is reasonable to argue that Cromwell stepping in was a reasonable thing to do. But he was a bloody-minded dictator. So after the Civil War period, the English are very, very clear, and the British after them, not to have a big standing army on British soil. Even in the case of the British Empire, the army was dispersed around the empire. It wasn't based in Britain. In World War I, the army was in France. You okay?
Yeah, I got it. She just threw my thing on the side.
Yeah. The army was in France. In World War II, the army was in France and in Germany and elsewhere. And after World War II, during the Cold War, as part of NATO, the British army was in Germany, facing the communists on the inter-German border. But the English learned that an army at home is a threat to the government because the army can decide at any point that the government is illegitimate, illegal, or whatever, and just overthrow them, which is what Cromwell does. So one of the reasons why the English are going to be so evolutionary in the future and so against the idea of having a big army, and they like a big navy, they like a small, very efficient army, but they're against the idea of a big European continental-style army because the last time they had one, it took over the country. And their general, Cromwell, became Lord Protector, dictator. This is like a Latin American banana republic. It really is. It's where the army launches coup d'etat, where they're called golpe de estado, in these Latin American countries. It's nasty. So understand that there is a dark side to Oliver Cromwell, but I will say this. The man was not vainglorious. One day, a guy was painting a portrait of him. And Cromwell asked to see the portrait before it was done, and the painter said, sure. And Cromwell said, why in the bells of Christ? You know, because he says that a lot in the movie. Did you paint this model? This isn't me. Where are my warts? Oliver Cromwell had a warty face. You will paint me warts and all. And the expression warts and all is still in the English language for somebody who insists on being dealt with as they are, not in some idealized form. You will paint me warts and all. Cromwell did not want to be a dictator. He ended up, like many dictators, saying that he was forced into it by circumstance. And it's arguable that he might have been, but oh man, he was a good dictator in the sense he was an effective ruler. But bad for democracy, bad for the English parliamentary democracy. Oh yeah, very bad. But it does establish Parliament is over the king. The later two stewards that are appointed after the Civil War don't understand this, and that's why they're out, and a new dynasty, the Hanoverians, get brought in. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Did you miss me not giving you a worksheet? I mean, if you're sad about that, I suppose we could do something.
I'm thankful, actually.
Your grades. If you don't like them, fix what you did and turn it back in. If you don't know what you did that earned a lower grade, come see me. Have a good day.